I'm all right.
I'm so happy to see you. Hi, Professor Winchester. Good to see you. Happy holidays.
And to you, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, glad you could come and I
Film here.
I first knew him as his faculty advisor in his freshman year, and so the first few times we met, Dan was class of 60, so of course this was the fall of 1956. The first time we met, first few times, what he might be interested in, what courses he might take, and so on. And then, perhaps after 3 or 4 weeks, they'd come in once a week at the beginning usually. After 3 or 4 weeks, we talked a little more personally, and it turned out that his family came from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is where I come. He himself had gone to school, been brought up in a little town outside of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Dutch town called Emmaus, and gone to high school there. It also developed that Dan's father had been killed at the end of the war. He was in the Army Air Force in the Pacific, but it was after the war was over, flying back from California to their base in Dayton, his plane disappeared in the Rocky Mountains. And so Dan's mother was left with 4 children, 2 older sisters, Dan, and a younger brother. And it was pretty tight going, I would gather. So Dan did well in school. Emmaus is a tiny little Pennsylvania Dutch town. He had really never been much of anywhere except right around there. But Dan somehow was a person who impressed you almost on first knowing. A fine scholar and also a terrific athlete. He was varsity football, varsity lacrosse. His senior year, I taught him to play squash, which he'd never played before. The second time we played, he beat me 4 games to 1. But he never told me in his freshman year that he was a football player. I have negative interest in football,
right? And
he never told me that he was captain of the freshman team. But sophomore year, I saw him outside of Dickinson, shoulder all done up in a plaster cast, and I said, "Whatever happened to you?" Well, I found out he'd been injured throwing the winning pass in the Penn game the Saturday before, and he just never mentioned that he played football in our conversations. That wasn't, that wasn't part of it. As I say, his father had been killed at the end of the war, and it happens that Emily, my wife, and I don't have children. I don't mean to say that this was a substitute father-son relationship. Things are what they are. But Dan needed an older man, an older friend, and I was very glad to respond to a younger man. So we became not just advisor and advisee, but good friends. He never took a course with me, but we've talked all the way through college, even his junior and senior year, and he decided to major in French. Of course, they had no language teaching at his high school at all. He wrote a thesis with the head of the French department then, thesis on Montaigne, and by the time the thesis had been turned in, of course, he had the Rhodes Scholarship, and that was known, and they gave him highest honors on his thesis. It was a good thesis, but when he came back after being graded, he came to see me, and he said, "I'm shocked." He said, "They gave me a 1+, a highest honors on my thesis." He said, "You know and I know that that's not a 1+ thesis." Dan himself at Princeton had, of course, been a notable athlete. He was known for that. But he was also a very good scholar. He graduated, as I say, with highest honors. He thought they only ought to be high honors at best, but they were highest honors. He read widely, not just in French, but in American literature. And we would often talk about what he'd read. Moby Dick fascinated him particularly, as it has many a person, including me. We'd talk about having the white whale and what that had to do with the way we might live and all. He was truly interested in other people, never never in his life did it ever occur to him somehow to try to put somebody down. In fact, he once told me after we got to know each other better that I sometimes did that. I ought not to.
Right.
And so at Oxford, you could stay there 2 or 3 years. He decided to stay 3. He himself was the captain of the rugby. They don't call them teams. What do they call them? Anyway, the one that plays against Cambridge at Twickenham. Emily and I went to watch the game, and then afterwards, this was just at the end of what we would call the fall semester, we took a sort of tourist motor trip with Dan through central England and had a very nice time together. And I'd been in touch with by correspondence. He never came back to this country during the 3 years he was at Oxford.
Oh.
In those days, you didn't come home for Christmas. You stayed there and finished up and then came home eventually. Well, he decided he wanted to go into politics. Somehow he was ambitious without ever seeming pushy or overtly ambitious. He wanted to make a difference in the world. I think he wanted to be President of the United States. I think he might have been. We'd have been a hell of a lot better off if he ever had been. So he went to law school, not because he wanted to be a lawyer, but because you have to have some kind of second string to your bow if you're going to go into politics, some way to fall back on a livelihood and some sort of qualification. So he went to Harvard Law School and did perfectly all right there. He met the girl he married. I think it was not right away, but anyway, they got to know each other, and he was doing fine. Then, after the first year of law school, he was home in Bethlehem for, his mother had moved to Bethlehem in the meanwhile. He was home to Bethlehem for a summer job and developed a kind of lump behind his left knee. And I was living, my wife and I were in France at the time, summer of 1964, and I got a letter from his mother that he'd had this lump and they'd gone to the doctor in Allentown, and he said it was a bad cancer, that he had to have his leg off immediately. Well, he didn't. He went back to Boston. As a Harvard student, he had health care from Harvard and went to Massachusetts General Hospital. And the surgeon there did a local resection to take out the bad part. I learned afterwards that that nobody ever recovers from that sort of cancer, cancer of the connective tissue there. And the doctor, I got to know him too, the surgeon there in Boston, thought it wouldn't be any use to do the amputation. He might as well leave him as much as he could. Of course, he didn't tell anybody that. He only told me afterwards. Well, Dan didn't let that stop him. He went back to law school and got through law school and got married. And then right afterwards, there was a second recurrence there in the knee, and he had to have a resection, and eventually he had to have 2 more operations that took the whole of his leg. So he lived for 3 years, a little over 3 years. After just finishing law school, he got a job in Allentown at a law firm, and by that time he and his wife had a little baby, little girl, and then he died. He was 27 years old, and he finally knew that he was dying, but he never gave up. He kept doing everything he could, and I was very much in touch. I drove him back and forth to Boston for all these terrible operations, and his classmates and football friends knew what was happening, and all of us were worried about what was going to happen to his wife and baby daughter, because there was 0 money behind him. And so several of us had the idea of trying to raise money that would support his widow and baby daughter until she was, say, through college, or else until they didn't need it anymore, and then revert to the support of the scholarship. The idea of the scholarship, had to, of course, go see the Nassau Hall about being allowed to do this. Fortunately, the president, Bob Coheed, and I are good friends. The treasurer wouldn't have let me do it because he didn't want any money raised except for central funds. Well, this is the only money raising I ever did, but with Dan's classmate Jack Horton, who was also a Rhodes Scholar, we managed between the football friends and so on to put together a fund of about $65,000 at the beginning. And I told Dan about it 2 or 3 weeks before he died. I wanted his approval. I told him about the plan for the scholarship. He said he liked that. He said that has scope. So it is proved. Well, as it happened, Joan, his wife, did remarry a mutual friend of theirs 3 years later, so we were able to start the scholarship in 1970. Dennis Sullivan, class of 70, was the first Sachs scholar. And I won't go into all the details of the one since then. The original arrangement was that Dan named the people he wanted to be responsible for it. It was his classmate Jack Horton, whom I mentioned, and then his brother Bill, and 2 other Oxford friends, not Princeton graduates, but other Rhodes Scholars who were good friends at Oxford, Matthew Nimitz and Bob Orrell, and myself. And we were the ones, originally we were trustees. The money had to be in the bank, but then we moved into the university, and our role was essentially advisors to the trustees as to what to do with the income from that money. And we just, the 5 of us selected the scholars for the first 10 years or so. And then we decided that eventually we would want to turn the responsibility over to former scholars. We decided we had former scholars on the selection committee beginning about 1979 or 1980, thereabouts. And we decided when I retired in 1987 that would turn it all over to the former scholars. So the former scholars are now the ones who are responsible for safeguarding and using that fund, selecting the scholar, and perhaps augmenting the fund when possible. And I may say here to any of you former scholars who happen to see this, you have an important watching brief. It's hard, you can't trust universities with funds that you give them for purposes. So I could name 5 or 6 endowed funds at Princeton that have simply disappeared into general funds because the people who gave them for the original purpose were no longer around. People forgot what they were for, and the money reverted to just general funds. The deed provides that the terms of the scholarship cannot be changed except with the consent of the former scholars, and then only in some way that they approve. You're watching brief to watch over that in future years when I'm gone and when the first scholars are gone and so on in future years. You will have to find some way to watch that and to continue control of the funds. Well, you know the purposes of the scholarship. I don't need to go into that. It has been, to me, let me see, this year we're choosing the 39th scholar as I speak. To me, it has been a great satisfaction, a joy really, and has succeeded far better than any of us could possibly have hoped. The quality of the people is superb. Their interest in the scholarship has been maintained. They become friends of each other across the generations, and none of us could have imagined that it would work this well. We thought at the beginning, we started with about $65,000, that we didn't know whether we'd be able to keep going indefinitely, that if need be, we would spend down the principal and do it right as long as we could. Fortunately, we had, for the money has been coming in, and I'm sure it will in the future, and that too may be part of your responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
At Worcester College, of course, they remember Dan too, and they set a high value on the Sachs scholarship, a very high value, so much so that Worcester and Princeton have now entered an exchange relationship for undergraduates for a semester abroad sort of thing.
I remember actually when I was at Worcester, you came and visited me in between the years.
I think I visited every scholar while he was there, up until, long about 2000, 2001, when I haven't been going to Europe anymore, so I haven't been back since then.
When I was heading off to Worcester, you drew me a detailed map on how to get from the train station to the front gate of Worcester College, and reminded me repeatedly that the traffic is driving on. They're driving on the left-hand side of the road, so be very careful when you cross the road.
Originally, I thought it would be very difficult to learn to drive on the left-hand side. I have never found that difficult, but I have found it difficult to remember when crossing a street to look right instead of left. And I've known of 2 or 3 people who have had bad accidents crossing the street that way in England. Now, why it's easier to drive on the left, but when you're walking, not to remember about that, how other people are driving, I don't understand, but it is true. And so I guess I didn't want any harm to befall any of you innocent youngsters. I think the difference is not so much geographical as it is psychological. That is to say, people have stopped reading very well. They look at screens. A friend of mine teaching in New York at at a day college there, Manhattan College, says that his students don't read things anymore. They'll only read what's on the screen. And he has to assign videos instead of books if he wants to get them to read anything. Well, it isn't the same.